Hello, welcome to the Art Channel. In this film, we're visiting an exhibition of work by Richard Long called Earth Sky at Houghton Hall in Norfolk. Richard Long is a land artist working primarily with materials he finds on walks in the landscape or in situ where he builds sculptures.
So here we are in the centre of a piece called White Deer Circle, which very much responds to the landscape. We have, I think, 16 oak tree stumps which have been craned in after Long decided on their placement. And I think it really responds to the landscape, perhaps rather than the house.
Well, he's sourced the stumps from the surrounding parkland, from all these extraordinary old trees that have grown over hundreds of years, and he's displaced them, but at the same time they feel very integral to this landscape. They sit very organically, don't they, within this circle.
And it is a place that the deer use, so it actually has become part of the landscape. And I think it's interesting, they're organic, and we'll see how they age over the coming seasons. So it really feels as if you're standing in the centre of an ancient henge. It's very beautiful. It lacks a kind of formal geometry that some of the other Long pieces have. It's much more in and of the landscape.
Yes, it feels more natural than his stone pieces. There's less kind of orchestration, less of that sort of tension between organisation and the natural sort of character of the stone, which he uses in those other pieces in this exhibition. But there is still a sense of ordering, of the circular character of the sculpture, and of this connection to us physically and to the environment around it, from which, of course, these stumps have grown in.
And it's always, I mean, it's worth saying that it's wonderful to be in the piece of work. You can touch it, you will walk around it, you can see it from different angles, and even for installation pieces, that's still quite unusual.
And finally, I think I'd say there is something quite kind of primal about standing in a circle. You mention henges, and there's a reason why they were built by prehistoric peoples. There's a sort of completion and perfection in the circularity and our place within it. So we've come to look at Houghton Cross, which is made of upright slabs of slate that rest against each other, so they're self-supporting. And this work is very characteristic of Richard Long's sculptural practice, isn't it? I mean, it's tremendous. You get all of this spiky, jagged, hard edges rising up from the ground, but at the same time it marks a cross in this very kind of elemental way.
You're right, a cross is an ancient way to mark a spot. We all do it, we all have done it. And this is more typical, more familiar of his work. I think it's particularly interesting because we're in this incredibly formal garden, and we're perhaps more used to seeing objects like this constructed in a wilderness, in a wild landscape. So there is a huge contrast between this construction and the space it's in.
What I always notice about his work, and I'm drawn in by, is that dialogue between its arrangement, the formality of it, while at the same time he's able to really elevate and celebrate the intrinsic character of the stone that he's using.
I mean, you slow down, there's one material in use here, just this Cornish slate, and it's very beautiful. And you also begin to admire, it's a proper piece of architecture, it's a construction. It may look casual when you come in, but each stone relies on the stone next to it, so it's a wonderful kind of puzzle.
In that way, it's actually paradoxically delicate too. I mean, you can see the sturdiness, that sort of ancient quality of the slate, but they are very delicately resting one against the other in order to maintain the kind of solidity and shape of the work.
So here we are with a piece made specifically for the show and for this space, north, south, east, west, and it's a mixture of local flint and Cornish slate, and you can see that he has combined his sort of themes, the cross and the circle, in this amazingly formal space.
Well, we're in a stone hall. It's very elaborately carved, full of statuary, classical busts. And then we focus here in the centre of the hall on Richard Long's orchestration of these raw materials. And you can see the contrast, can't you, between this local Norfolk flint and the upright Cornish slate. And you get just that very simple, very direct contrast. It returns us to the earth, to geology, to ancient time, really.
It's absolutely beautiful, isn't it? In one way, very different from the space we're in, but picking up on these muted greys and blacks and these kind of slightly off-white colours, so it ties into this floor beautifully. And I think it's interesting that he doesn't work with other people. There is no team of technicians, there are no studio assistants. So everything is literally a labour of love. Things are made solely by him, and he talks about the act of making being, a real practice, a real kind of contemplation.
He's really kind of sort of channeling the character of these stones. And what I noticed looking at a Richard Long sculpture is the infinite variety of the material, but in a way whereby they share similar traits. If you look at these chalk orbs, that they are endless in terms of the surface, the detail, but they share this kind of congruence. They come from the same material. And
there's a real joy in materials and colour and the kind of tactile, the physical quality of these bits of earth. And they always are a celebration, and there's a truth to materials which is really refreshing.
And what we should mention, of course, is the contrast with the works outside in the park and in the garden, because something does change, doesn't it? Bringing a sculpture like this from the landscape into the heart of this domestic and historic interior. And that's very characteristic, again, of Richard Long's practice, whereby he will make work in situ, site-specifically, but then he will also bring geology, nature, into the domestic room and environment.
And he's been making circles and crosses for 40 years, but every time he makes one, it's different. It responds to the space.
And it becomes almost like the sort of centre of the world, because these crosses point outwards towards these four kind of cardinal directions, going out as kind of invisible lines around the whole globe. It's very specific, local, and universal at the same time.
And it does, I think, finally draw your attention to this space. Not that you couldn't notice it, but you begin to see it in a different way. I certainly pick up on the colours because I'm looking at the colours in the sculpture, so I respond to this space differently because this beautiful object is here. So we're outside the house and we're with a piece called A Line in Norfolk, which is 84 metres of carr stone, local stone, mined about 9 or 10 miles away. And this is really a stunning piece of work. It sits in the middle of this formal lawn, and you get this wonderful red, orange and green. So it's a very dramatic piece.
It's very wild and raw and direct, geological. But there's something, again, very aestheticised about it. It's very pure, isn't it? It's very beautiful to look at. And rather like the piece in the hall, it has this infinite sort of variety that pulls the eye in to look at the surface of the detail of these rocks. And you'll see accumulations of material since it's been kind of unveiled here in the garden. It gives it a very kind of sort of natural and organic feel. And we should remember too about how it extends these sight lines down into the landscape from the house, from the facade, almost sort of 2 miles down in that direction. It has this kind of alignment. It's almost mathematical, isn't it?
And he is always interested in, I think, making those visual, emotional connections. It's never something that just sits in a space, sits in a landscape.
This is both an intuitive and an intellectual process, because of course he's using his eye and his judgment to arrange these stones, while at the same time he's sort of ordering it and structuring it. It's very constructed. It is a piece of sort of overt sculpture.
So we spent some time looking around at the Richard Long sculptures, and I think it's really interesting to see that he responds differently to different kinds of landscapes or different kinds of interiors. We looked in the Stone Hall where the piece was very intense and condensed. We've been out in the landscape in this kind of formal lawn and in less formal parts of the grounds, and always I think they're very grand, but I think they do respond with a light touch. They never overwhelm or dominate the landscape.
The garden is very formal, it's very designed in that 18th century sort of affectation of nature, but actually Richard Long takes us to the natural world. And at the heart of his artistic practice is this wandering, this meandering, almost a nomadic style of practice, whereby he's sorting and gathering natural materials, which he then arranges in this very precise and conceived way. And a work like this, really sets up this kind of crackling tension, and he's very successful at it.
I think they're still relevant. I mean, he's been making work for 40 plus years, but still they do ground you, they bring you back to the space and the time that you're in, and they are, in one way, a very simple pleasure. You look at a beautiful shape, a simple ancient shape like a cross, you look at materials like slate, like limestone, sandstone, and you really enjoy those textures and colours, and that's something very difficult to pull off in the 21st century.
And he reminds us too of natural systems and processes, of geology, of time, of materiality, and of growth too, which we saw in the circle of tree stumps. So he's really sublime in that sense. He reconnects us to landscape and to nature, and he reminds me really of that romantic tradition in English art and in literature. I think of William Wordsworth and the walks that he makes in the Lake District. So I think this work is important, it's significant.
I think you're absolutely right, it is part of a trajectory of English landscape painting and sculpture, and that romance, that sublime. But I think also, starting to work in the late 1960s, he taps into a minimalist aesthetic. So you get this very interesting combination of concepts, of ideas. So I think what he makes is uniquely English art.
Thank you for watching this film on the Art Channel about Richard Long's exhibition Earth Sky at Houghton Hall. If you've enjoyed this film, please give it a thumbs up. You can also share and distribute it. For further information about our films on the Art Channel, please follow us on social media, on Twitter, Instagram and on Facebook.